Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. We've got a great interview today with guest and friend of the show, Marinus Petersen, who is a former professional cyclist, used to race in Normandy in the north of France, and is now transitioning back to triathlon. Thought back to triathlon. He was a runner, did some cycling. He goes through his story. But a really great guy to talk to because he's a massive fan of the sport and super knowledgeable in the area. He's got an undergraduate degree from Loughborough in sports science and is just a massive student of sport performance physiology. And we really wanted to talk to him, and what the nature of the interview is about is really what can runners learn from cyclists, because we've all observed that so much of what hits running in terms of innovation started out in cycling. And you can think about carbohydrate metabolism and using fueling to aid performance, cooling, heat, altitude. So much of this stuff started off in the cycling space. And I always feel like runners are just lagging behind a little bit. So I think with Tour de France starting, just having a bit of a lens on what are the cyclists up to and what can we learn from them. And it's not saying that we should just replicate what they're doing in cycling. Like, there's obvious differences, what we discussed in the episode, but definitely some things we can learn from cycling and help make running a bit more professional.
Yeah. I think I was going to say, like, it's not necessarily we talk about, like, optimizing gear. There's less scope to do that in running, but I think with Marinus especially, it's the willingness to, like, try stuff and be open to stuff. And you hear a lot of professional athletes that don't, maybe are talking about some equipment or the training they're doing and probably don't really get it. And with some, you can sense they're just following orders right. Whereas I don't think Marinus is ever like that. He's willing to try stuff, and it might go wrong, but you can learn something from that. We didn't mention on the episode, but I came across Marinus in a group chat where he was mixing bicarb in jam to take before races. So there's obviously delivery systems that are maybe not that cost efficient, especially if you're racing a lot. And he had decided, well, you can just put this in some form of sugar and it probably does most of the same thing. That was how I came across Marinus, and that sort of, to me, is like part of the reason to speak to him, right? Is that, like, okay, here's something that I want to use. How can I do it myself? I'll give this a go and see if it works. And he optimized it a bit. There was talk about the ratios of jam to bicarb. And that's the sort of thinking that's really interesting, right? It almost doesn't matter what sport. It's that's your mindset, is how can I optimize this and make it better and learn something from that, rather than just, buying a product and using it, or being given a product and using it. That's really interesting to speak to those people, isn't it?
Yeah, and just having a fresh set of eyes on how to approach training. Because it's so easy just to do what you've always done, or just look at what has historically happened in running and just keep doing that. And there is small innovation there, but I think that some of these big leaps happen when you get someone who's not got that history in the sport necessarily, and you can go and just take different ideas, and they're not all going to work, but some of them might. And then that's going to put you ahead of everyone who's following this more traditional, slower paced evolution in training. So I think it was a really good chat. I enjoyed talking to him. Could have talked to him for another hour, I think. Yeah. It was. I hope you guys enjoy it. Before we get to that, we've got Saw to thank.
Yep. Yeah. So as always, Saw sponsoring the podcast. Been making the most of their warm weather gear the past few weeks. Trying to stay cool on some of our runs. It's been harder on a few, but we wanted to just mention Saw have a project called Saw Women Project, and it is basically the opportunity, or they're looking for female athletes, and the way they phrase it is, we're looking for women with a clear goal, a reason for chasing it, and a pursuit worth following. And there's a form that will be in our show notes, where female athletes that are chasing, as I said, chasing a goal, doing something within running, not necessarily just looking for a time. They mention a specific route or a record, or coming back from, something, whether that's a life event or an injury. And they want to hear from you and potentially look at supporting, your goal and your journey, with kit and whatever else SOAR can provide. So there's a form to complete. It's in the show notes if you're interested. Yeah, definitely have a look. And yeah, especially for our female listeners, or our male listeners that might run with someone, or have a family member or friend that is doing something cool and interesting. Yeah, check it out, because it's a really cool project. Cool to support stuff like that, right? That there's, again, talking about cycling, there's like fastest known times in cycling, which I think are really cool. There's an Instagram account called Fastest Known Times that tracks them, and I think the aesthetics of stuff like that is really cool. There's a bit of it with like the ultra running sort of scene, but yeah, not just running a 5K PB, but running a route, or doing something with a different aesthetic is quite cool, and the sort of thing that you expect SOAR to support. So check it out.
Yeah, I've never attempted any of these FKTs. Is that what they called it?
Yeah,
FKTs?
there's one in South Wales that I sort of don't want to mention, because I'd sort of like to go for it. But well, it's the Taff Trail, but like you basically start where your castle stage started, all the way down to
Yeah.
Cardiff Bay. I kind of like the aesthetic of that. That it's like you run the river where we live. I think that's pretty cool. So
Well,
there's a few around.
canal. The canal from my house goes from all the way, from north of Newport up to Brecon, and I think it's about 50 miles. And I've always fancied giving that a go. I don't know if it's an FKT, but just for a challenge,
I think there probably would be. The Fastest Known Times website is pretty like comprehensive, and it's quite cool. Like you get specific evidence, and for some of them you need like witnesses, and then the type of support varies the type of like fastest known time you get. So you can have completely unsupported, or like self-supported. And when you get really into it, you have stuff like if you get filmed by a film crew, that changes the type of like support that you have, because they're moral support. It's this whole own world that's really cool, and it's cool that SOAR recognize that, as well as running fast times in established races.
Yeah, definitely. We're also really excited to welcome back a previous supporter of the show in Currens, the New Zealand blackcurrant supplement. So if you're a runner focused on the finer details of performance, recovery, and long-term health, you'll want to know more about Currens, a new powerhouse in polyphenol nutrition for endurance athletes. Currens is a New Zealand blackcurrant extract that's been recognized as European Sports Nutrition Product of the Year, and has become a firm favorite among runners of all levels, from everyday marathon runners right through to elite ultra-distance athletes. It's backed by over 60 human trials. Currens has built a reputation in the running community for its broad-ranging research-led benefits. It's trusted by athletes who put their bodies under serious stress, including world 24-hour champion Sarah Webster. I used it myself in the run-up to my 211 marathon in Seville, and used it over the course of the winter, and really felt like it made a difference to both my recovery rate, but also my ability to keep coming out and putting out really good, solid, hard marathon-specific long runs on back-to-back weeks. Currens is easy to use. It's batch tested and suitable for runners across the spectrum, whether you're training for your first 10K, chasing a marathon PB, or pushing limits in ultras. We can offer you a 15% discount off your first purchase using the discount code Physiology20. We'll put a link in the show notes, but if you go to currens.com and use the discount code Physiology15, you'll get 15% off your first order.
Yeah, really excited to have Currens back. Yeah, as you said, you used it before Seville, and we all used it before Valencia, and yeah, felt there was good benefits with no side effects, as we said. And I'd also say go back and listen to the interview with Dr. Sam Shepherd. Back in November, December time, we talked to him about the research on New Zealand blackcurrants and where the sort of state of play is with research on supplements. That was a really good listen, and yeah, worth checking out as well.
Yeah, and I think, again, just there's so much noise out there and hype around certain products. Some products are very noticeable, used by lots of athletes, and may or may not have benefits, but that's sort of my point is that Currens actually has a lot of research behind what it does, especially on muscle soreness, muscle damage, and our ability to restock our muscle glycogen stores, which is super, super interesting and could actually have a lot of benefit for your ability just to carry out a training block. So I mean, I did notice the benefits myself, and the research is actually at a good level and not all just in-house stuff. It's not in-house at all. It's all done by completely separate universities, institutions. So yeah, go check them out in the show notes. Can only recommend them.
Yeah, cool. Should we head to the interview now?
Yeah, enjoy the interview. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed this chat. It was really, really good to speak to Marinus, a really interesting guy. Some great, just makes you think, doesn't it? Just makes you think about how could I approach things differently.
Yeah, that's the aim with this podcast, isn't it? Make people think.
So absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Enjoy the interview. So we're really excited today to be joined by Marinus Petersen. Marinus is currently competing as a triathlete. He has a background at a very high level in cycling, and we're really excited just to talk about the crossover and moving from one endurance sport to another, what maybe runners could learn from cycling. So yeah, really excited. Thanks for joining us today, Marinus.
Thank you very much for having me, Owen. I'm very excited to chat to you today. I was a bit worried about living up to the reputation of some of your previous guests, but then I saw your last guest was ChatGPT, so I felt a bit more like I could live up to that.
Yeah, hopefully, the days of the week, like Claude was getting that mixed up. So that's
well, you can test me on it if you need to.
So yeah, I guess we sort of thought we'd leave it to you to introduce yourself. If you're just okay to go through, I guess, some of your cycling history, because there's quite a lot of nuance to cycling, I guess, in the same way there is with running as well. But I guess what level were you competing at, and what did that sort of look like in terms of like the training and the racing, and where were you racing, for example?
Yeah, so a bit of a problem for my cycling was I started racing when I was at Loughborough University. So yeah, at the time they just started having a cycling performance squad when I was there, because they got it for athletics and hockey, netball, all the sort of normal sports. But so I was actually studying just like mathematics when I first got there, and then Dave Nichols, who had been coaching at Dimension Data, started up a cycling program, and they did some. I've been cycling a little bit, but not so seriously, and he did just like sort of critical power test on a turbo, and then from that kind of got me onto the squad. Thought I had a lot of potential, so I ran with that and started taking it more seriously, started training more. And then my university and cycling experience was quite compromised by COVID. So I didn't actually get much on campus time I then switched to sports science, having gotten more into cycling. And then a lot of that degree was remote. And then I also lost a lot of racing development through that. So there was a Arceus Samsic, who we were just talking about offline, did run a talent ID program, just looking at people's training data in 2020. So I was selected as one of the winners of that, but then from COVID carrying on and an injury I got, nothing too much happened from that. Although I did eventually get connected with a team in France to go and race for them, and that was in 2024. I've skipped a bit of in betweens here, but I still kind of managed to use that connection to go and race for a team in France in 2024 in Saint-Brieuc, in Brittany. So that was, so racing domestically in France at that sort of level is kind of a bit like, I don't know, like playing for Wrexham United or something. It's like sort of professional, you can kind of survive, but it's pretty tough. Like I was living on top of the service course of the team, so it's like the worst combination of having like no privacy, but then you're also like you're on your own. But like any moment, early in the morning, late at night, people can just be coming in from a race and like bringing the bikes in, or just like coming to fix something. Or so that was the first year somewhere in 2024 in France, and then moved on to a different team in Normandy with a nicer but also in lots of different ways challenging setup in 2025. I missed out that I did race a few years in the UK. I won the Welsh Road Race Championships, which was nice. In 2021, won some other national road races, and always felt like a good thing when I won a race, because I'd always win it solo because I've got no sprint. I've got reasonable anaerobic capacity, but like my sort of less than 30-second power is terrible. So managed to win the Severn Bridge Road Race in 2023 and a few other Nat B races. Then in France in 2025 I won 2 races, both big solo victories again, some other podiums, top 10s and stuff. And then the end of 2025 I was struggling with the sort of the like handling my bike in the like my bike handling. It's not, I wouldn't say that was my main limiter. It was more like just being afraid of crashing in the peloton, and that was really limiting my ability to translate my physiology into results. So I was always found the racing like really scary, seeing all these crashes, and then also because I got more scared, that then kind of fulfilled, me thinking, oh, that you're doing well by racing in a risk averse way, and then I'd race even more risk averse and then get even worse results relative to my physiology. But still all the time training hard, and I still, pursued that dream for a long time, and I still don't really like the identity of being a triathlete, but it's fits funny with me. But anyway, that's what I'm doing now, and it's a different world. It's pros and cons, but at least it's safe.
I mean, I think cyclists are the hardest endurance athletes on the planet, in terms of, obviously you've got to be incredibly fit, but the risk is so high and people do die. Like, it's not like you're scared for no reason. You could end up with life-changing injuries or death.
So I worked with a sports psychologist who sponsored me basically and we talk every single week and for a couple of years, and I don't think I would have been able to keep on doing it that long. And I was basically, I'd say to him, just hypnotize me, just whatever you do, just to get me to be able to do these races. And it did help. But he's saying, but at the end of the day, these are rational thoughts you're having, because it is really dangerous, and there's only so much you can do to work with that.
Yeah, it's pretty. I was gonna say, it's pretty funny in contrast, where like we'll say like, oh, like Cardiff Park Run's a bit of a dangerous start because there's like some pushing and shoving, but you're moving at at the start of that you're going at like
20k an hour,
30k sort of thing. Like but even back in the pack, it's a bit like pushy and shovey, and then it's like, okay, times that by like sort of 5+ on the speed, and you're moving on a bike as well, and there's things that you can hit. Like, you're not going to hit a tree on Cardiff Park Run start.
In Cardiff Park Run, you know where you're going. Whereas a lot of the races I was doing, like, you'd be going down descents, roads that you mostly never have the chance to recce, around a load of riders from all over the world who you don't know. Because in France, like, people come from all over the world to race in that domestic scene, and it's just loads of random people on roads you've never seen, and you just have to put blind faith in. They are, for the most part, experienced, knowledgeable riders, but it only takes one person to make a mistake, and then you have a catastrophe.
Do you think that if you'd started riding as a junior, that those bike handling skills would have been better, and so you'd have been able to perform at a higher level? Or do you think it's just a personality trait in that you respect risk a little bit more than maybe other riders?
I think it's both, because you look at like most of the riders who are successful, and this was kind of frustrating for me. I'd look at other riders who'd started racing their bike, doing cyclocross and track when they were like 8 years old, and for them it's just like for them it felt like it was a totally like physiology and tactical sport. Like, it felt like just so effortless to them. But again, like, how much of that is personality? Like, I would say I'm not like I look at my brother who does skateboard, scooter riding, and he loves just adrenaline and thrill seeking stuff. And like, I can't relate to that. So, if I think you possibly, it does help to have a bit more of that type of your personality, but it also, I think, yeah, it's both basically. There's no, but both help, and it's hard to exactly disentangle all of it.
In terms of physiology, then, how far do you reckon you were off making a world tour team? Because I think one of the beauties of cycling is it is so quantifiable in terms of power outputs and power to weight, etc. Do you have a good idea of what it takes to make that jump?
Yeah, well, I think that's why Arkea Samsic selected me. They selected me and Kevin Vauquelin and a few other riders, and you look at the 10 riders they selected, and I think I'm the only, they selected 10, and it's maybe me and one other are the only ones that haven't made it like Pro Conti or World Tour, and one of them's been Kevin Vauquelin, who's 4th in the Tour de France or something. And yeah, like at my best, my threshold power was over 6 watts per kilo, and my 5 and 2 minute power were, and 10 minute power, watts per kilo were very good. And yeah, I good road bike aerodynamics as well. But yeah, it's funny because like there are some riders in the World Tour with surprisingly weak physiology. If you look at a lot of traditional metrics, and there are some incredible riders who are never going to get a contract. Like, one of the best examples there is, I don't know if you heard about Jack Burke, for example. He got the KOMs on Alpe d'Huez, Stelvio and stuff. And if you listen to his podcast, you can, he talk, I find everything he puts out so relatable, and he's probably worked even harder and even more talented than me physiologically, and he's still, he couldn't get a contract, and he tried a lot harder for a lot longer, and is probably at least as more talented than I am. So, and there's lots of guys like that, but then there's also lots of guys who've just been in the right place at the right time, get some results. They know the managers, they might slip them a bit of this or that, and it's, yeah. But they're also credit to a lot of riders with less physiology. It's a sport, it's not a lab test, and there's winning a lot of types of races. Like Mark Cavendish was, his sprint power was very good, but his sort of threshold power, for example, was very very unimpressive by World Tour standards. But he knew how to race, he knew how to ride his bike, and in those areas he put someone like me to shame. So that's why he won more stages of the Tour de France than anyone else in history.
I guess that's a good contrast to running, which I think is 99% physiology. I mean, tactics do come into play, but nowhere near to the same extent. And just you can't just rely on good racecraft that you probably can in cycling to give you a significant margin, like you said in the case of Mark Cavendish.
Yeah. Like in running, it might be the difference between being 3rd and 1st in the Olympic final, but it's not the difference between whether you're an amateur and a World Tour rider.
Would you be happy to share some power numbers? Because I know people like that. You don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah, sure. So like, my best, my best session of 3 by 20 minutes on some kind of flat rolling roads in Normandy last year, I did 430 watts. I did 4 by 8 minutes at 480, 2 minutes at 680. A 5 minute, I wish I tested that in my best, because I did one early season at like 542, and I know from my other training I gained a lot of power, and like when I was racing my best, felt like I probably could have done something like 560. That's on a climb out of the seat. I'm not saying I could do that in TT position or anything. But yeah, and then because there was like a road bike time trial I did against my I was on a road bike and all my teammates were on TT bikes, didn't have a TT bike. I managed to go faster than them by doing like 470 watts for like 7.5 minutes on this flat road, and I'd already done a threshold session just before, and then the team manager called me up to come and go to do it. But my watts per kilo wasn't at its best then. I was probably about 74 kilos because I was just flat racing. In 2023, I was 69 kilos, and my numbers were pretty much the same for everything sort of 5 minutes and up. But that sort of 1-2 minute power was just a little bit worse. And that's kind of what I found the effect of having that extra muscle mass, as well as just feeling like a bit of extra muscle mass just gave me a bit more like sort of grunt and testosterone to just sort of survive living and racing in France. But I didn't really find it gave me more aerobic power.
Yeah, this was one of the sort of notes we had just about I guess the performance model and power to weight, but also, as you mentioned, just surviving, right? Because the race schedule is so much different to what a runner would experience. And then in your situation as well, you're talking about living above the service course, which is essentially just a warehouse that all of the team's kit is in. So imagine, someone that that raced at the UK champs the other week said, "Oh yeah, I live in the warehouse that like sports shoes keep their stock in." You'd just be like, "What are you doing?" But you're not the only person that I've heard sort of doing that in terms of cycling. So that's, like you say, if you don't get to the minimum sort of weight that you can maintain, it maybe means that you're not constantly getting ill and you're able to race right.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also like a bit of my logic for being a bit heavier for racing in France and Normandy was basic. It was more around like it doesn't make any difference on the flat. So like basically the only climbs are like 1 or 2 minutes, and you also, because they're short, you're going such a high speed that actually the determinant of your speed is more watts per CDA than it is watts per kilo. So like if I'm doing 8 watts per kilo, but that's 550 watts instead of 500 watts, the speed on a 5% climb when I'm going like 35k an hour is going to be much higher if I'm heavier doing the same or less watts per kilo. And then of course when it comes to the flat road, then you're just going a higher speed. So that's kind of the main rush. And even just like looking at the other types of riders that are being successful in over those sort of parcours, and when I was 69 kilos, I was like, I'm small and withered compared to them. And also a little bit of just thinking like maybe something magic will happen if I just like try racing heavier. And I guess I did gain like 0 to 2 minute and maybe to 5 minute power, but I didn't really gain much after that.
I think that makes sense. I mean, muscle mass has been associated with W prime and anaerobic capacity. The more muscle mass you have, it's going to influence those anaerobic and glycolytic characteristics more, or to a much greater extent than probably the aerobic characteristics, which actually, if you get too much muscle mass and too much hypertrophy, then they're less well perfused, each individual muscle fiber. There's a bigger gap between the capillary, where the oxygen needs to get to, and where the actual mitochondria are, which are going to use the oxygen.
Yeah, exactly. You're saying it can even work against you. And what I even found is when it came to races, like when I won Welsh Champs, I remember weighing myself after I'd done my low fiber, and that morning, and I was 67.7 kilos, which is absolutely tiny at 6'3". But I remember like racing back then with so little sprint or anaerobic capacity, basically just felt like every attack I was trying to follow, every move I was just sprinting as hard as I possibly could the whole race. And I could never really put myself into much of a hole. Whereas what I found when I was like bigger and I had this bigger anaerobic capacity, I could like burn massive matches and just put myself into a box mid race. Like I remember one race I was doing in Brittany, and there was like a break that I bridged across a minute gap to solo. But when I say bridged across, I got to the back of the group, and then I was about 20 meters after I closed this minute gap, and I just couldn't finish it. I just went all the way back to the other group. So you have to like more carefully manage your effort in races. So like when you've got this big turbo, yes, it's useful, but you have to kind of use it differently. And the same applied in training as well. Like you can just, it's useful, but you can also dig more of a hole with it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I relate to that. To you at 67 kilos, that's what I relate to. I can go as hard as I can and just keep it going. And racing a short a short distance, like a 5K, I can be in a box for a K and still hang on. That's fine. Whereas you see these more like middle distance profiles, like a 1500-meter athlete, and you'll talk to them afterwards, and they'll describe to you they were so chilled for a K, 2K, 3K, and then suddenly it was like something jumped on their back. Whereas they've got this massive box of matches they can burn through, but once they've burned through that, they're done. They've got nothing in reserve, or not. They think their speed is going to drop off so much.
Yeah. Do you find it helps you coaching as well of like even within yourself having experience being slightly different phenotype, because like I coach quite a variety of different riders, and some of them will be very fast twitch dominant, some of them very slow twitch dominant, and just having even seen like quite pronounced changes within your own physiology, and you think like you're only one person. That's one thing I have to try and think with my coaching now, like when I'm like writing someone's plan, whereas before I was try to think of myself doing this and how I'd feel the next day and the next day. And now I try to really like pull away from that and just really think like, what's it going to be like for this person? How are they going to respond to that? What have we seen when they've done those sort of things in the past? I was just off on a tangent there, but it is a coaching
it's
podcast,
definitely,
isn't it?
It's one thing to know about, like, to know about the theory, but to actually experience that. I've never experienced being explosive and powerful. I think it's probably just, it's probably, I don't know if there's less range in cycling to transition from one profile, in running, sorry, to transition from one profile to another, because you can't just put on more muscle mass in running and experience.
Yeah.
Same, I would say, because power to weight is always a factor, whereas in cycling, if you race on a flat, it's not really that much of a factor. But I'm sure I've definitely gone through periods where I've got more of that top end, but it's still not I don't think enough to really make a difference in terms of how I perceive a race or a session. Exactly.
Yeah. Like when I started cycling and I was really small, I could barely do 700 watts for a minute, and by the end I could do a good amount more than 800. So that's the magnitude of increase in that short range power was really big.
Yeah. I know you're a proper student of the sport, into both triathlon running and cycling, but I'd be really interested to know, in your mind, what is a typical like cycling? What does cycling training actually look like at the elite end? Because I think from running perspective, there's only a couple of different paradigms I think that people use. People are either doing Tuesday, Friday, or they're going 3 sessions a week, maybe. Normally some threshold in there and a bit of intensity, but it's pretty set. I don't think there's that many different ways of training. Whereas what I see from cycling is there's just more diversity. Would you say there is a typical, this is how World Tour cyclists train? And if so, what does that actually look like? I don't know if I've phrased that very well at all, but hopefully you've got...
That's good. Yeah. No, what I find interesting is actually, it's probably not that different from running, but so if you just look at number of hours per year trained, amongst the World Tour, there are very few people that train outside of the range of 900 to 1200 hours a year. So there are some riders that are doing a bit more than that, and there are some riders that are doing a bit less, but there are problems. Like doing more is difficult because you have to race so often and there's so much travel. And I think if it was more like running, so you could just peak for like 4 races a year, I think you would see a lot of cyclists doing 1400-hour years like you see triathletes doing. And then as to doing less, I think that's like, that depends a bit on your training style. I guess this is where varieties, like on UAE, for example, they do, so most of their, sub LT1 endurance riding is quite a lot closer to LT1. That's just their training style. They do a lot of, and they do a lot of like blocks, even like within sort of 10% of LT1. Whereas, and a lot of other teams, like the coaches, like on Ineos, for example, the riders will just be doing a lot of 6-7+ hour rides. Equate it to physiology, terms you're more familiar with, like, 45-50% of LT2, like, just really low intensity. And it's perhaps, you could say, they can get to similar results in the end but just if you're doing all your riding closer to LT1, then you don't do as many hours. But if you think of it in like running terms, it's basically just saying like I do 200k a week in 12 hours, or I take 15 hours to do it. Like when you're dealing with such big magnitudes of speed, because the hours spent sat on bicycle with Garmin saying go isn't what drives your physiology to change. It's the sort of turnover of energy, which is proportional to the work put into the pedals, which in running you can just use kilometers run as long as you're on the same sort of terrain all the time.
Would you think of it more in terms about total volume then? Do you, as a cyclist, would you think of it more in kilojoules versus just time?
I do, yeah. I do. And most people find it more convenient to, look at hours, because if I'm prescribing to you tomorrow, Dan, go out and do a 3,000 kilojoule ride, but you have to be back by 1:30, that's not so practical. Whereas if I just say go out, ride at 4 hours at this sort of range, so for prescription you'd probably give more like an intensity RPE range attached to a duration. But when I'm looking at like how much load has this person done this week compared to next week, last month, next month, whatever, I'm looking at total work done. But of course, I think even if you compare the total kilojoules that a 1,200 hour a year rider on Ineos or Visma is doing compared to the kilojoules that UAE is doing, I still think they're probably doing more kilojoules with the more volume. But I think there's also still a bit of a trade-off in the benefits you get from riding really easy versus really hard. Because I mean, like the magnitudes we're talking here is like a lot of riders on UAE, or you look at someone like Quinn Simmons, he rarely comes back on a non-recovery ride with an average power less than 300 watts. Whereas there are equivalent riders on like Ineos who are just as strong as him, who'll ride at 200 watts, 190 watts. And they're just as strong, but they're training in a very different way. So you look at running, that would be like some people are going out and doing 4-hour runs at 6:30 minutes per K, and some people are doing 3:30 per K runs on the canal or whatever, for only 90 minutes, 2 hours. So I'd say within that moderate intensity domain, there's probably a lot more variety than there is in running. And I think as to like structure of intensity, I'd say pretty standard is you don't very often see people doing 3 or like regularly doing 3 intensity days per week. More often it's 2 is very common and quite standard. And it's just those days then can be really big. So, it might be a long ride, 4, 5, 6 hours, and you just got interval spaced throughout the ride. Which, you don't see runners doing that either.
To dig into that, I think firstly, I think it's quite interesting that the frequency only seems to be twice a week, because in my mind, the cost of doing a bike session, like a hard bike session, is much less due to the muscle damage compared to a run session. Whereas runners often do 2 or 3 will often have 3 intensity days per week.
Yeah, I think what it is so when I look at like the run training sessions, like say like a session either of you two might do, you do like, I don't know, 5 times 6 minutes at LT2 or something, like that would be like an opener's warm-up type session for a cyclist. It's just like you do it with running because there's running economy stimulus, and you've got to have this frequency of like load to your tissues and stuff. But in cycling, you like at that sort of intensity, you might do 3 by 30 minutes, but you do that twice a week. So because you've got because you're like, in a way you could say cyclists are better at cycling than runners are at running, because they can train so much harder. And so like you get closer towards the limits of your physiology. So like to do a session that actually properly overloads your system, you have to do a lot more time at intensity. So like as a cyclist, you wouldn't do 5 by 6 minutes LT2, or if it would just be like an easy week or deload or taper session. In fact, for like sub-threshold or threshold efforts, I would never give someone an interval less than 10 minutes. And I prefer even 15 or 20 minutes. But, that is into the difference of running and cycling. Like, yeah, you can push a lot harder. Therefore, your fitness gets a lot closer to being optimized. Therefore, you have to do these bigger, harder days to actually move the needle. So it's just like big rest, big recovery, rather than running is just these frequent little stimulus, because that's what your tendons and bones and joints and stuff need.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, just the costs on the body as a runner is just so high that actually you can probably need a smaller dose more frequently versus these big, huge doses. Yeah.
Well, and also with this, cycling economy is not really that trainable. And sometimes it even goes down as people become more well trained. But it's just like, it's just barely moving from being, complete beginner off the street to being a world tour cyclist. Your economy doesn't really change. Whereas as a runner, that's like a big component of what's actually making you go from a beginner to a world-class runner. And that's where I think there's an advantage of more frequent, easier sessions, and also having the breaks between the reps and stuff so that you're fresher and getting better running economy stimulus out of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because, I mean, it was on my notes here to talk about, but in terms of running, it's a pretty standard physiological model. You got your VO2 max, your thresholds, and your economy, and together they're going to determine what's your top end, how close to that can you sustain during a race, and then how well are you converting that energy expenditure into actually running performance. And VO2 max, somewhat trainable, not that trainable. Thresholds, I'd say quite trainable, but economy just tends to get better quite slowly, but year on year on year. And one of the main distinguishers between someone, like you said, is who's world class and who is not, is actually their economy rather than their VO2 max necessarily. You need a high enough VO2 max. But when I've measured cyclists in the lab, tested them in the lab, you have really good cyclists and really poor cyclists, and their cycling efficiency is very similar.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, like, I don't know, like, you could, say like a pretty average, a reasonable club level cyclist, if you gave them Sebastian Salwe's running economy, they'd be pretty fast straight away without having to get sort of any fitter. Like, it's basically just the effect of running economy on performance is so big, isn't it? Like, you don't have to have a very high VO2 max to be an elite runner if you can have world class running economy.
Yeah. Well, I think, in terms of cycling efficiency, most people are somewhere between 19 and 22% efficient, maybe 23. Whereas like running economy, you can literally be twice as, your economy can be twice as good as another runner. You can have people who are using 250 mil per kilogram per kilometer, or you can have people who are like best ever recorded, like 150 mil per kilogram per kilometer, which is absolutely huge in terms of how fast they're going to run for given energy expenditure.
Yeah, it's wild.
Digging more into the intensity then, I think in a minute in running, threshold training is really popular, doing stuff from like LT1 to LT2 zone. Obviously, people are doing more intensity, and you've got like the likes of like the M11 track club and Keely Hodgson's group, and obviously just more middle distance athletes in general are going to have more intensity in the program. And by that, I mean like stuff above LT2 and all the way up to like max sprint speed. What does it look like in the pro peloton? What are there favored intensity distributions or favored models of how to include intensity into their program?
Yeah, every rider would either be sort of polarized or pyramidal, but a lot of teams, I'd say even the majority of teams, do little to no deliberate heavy domain training, basically at all. And I think a bit of that is because they get a lot of it from racing, and because they do 50 plus race days a year, that can just basically cover a lot of those heavy domain training sessions, because a lot of races can basically be like a 10 out of 10 heavy domain intensity session, because you might do like 3 30-minute climbs over a 4-hour race if you're a climber, for example. So I think, they talk about it as if there's really poor cost benefit for that heavy domain training, but I don't think some people appreciate just how much stimulus they're getting from the races, and that being heavy domain work. But for example, like Jumbo-Visma, that their training outside of racing is very polarized, very little threshold training, just lots of long, really easy rides, and then a lot of VO2 max and some sprint anaerobic capacity work. Some other teams like Uno X do a bit more, but the only team, well, are they the only team doing lactate controlled LT2 work? Maybe, or like with such a focus on it. But that's very, that was, even just a few years ago, that was like nothing like what anyone was doing. So yeah, a lot of VO2 max or just above threshold work all year round, and quite a good amount of anaerobic capacity stuff. And then when people do like heavy domain work, then compared to running, it's normally longer blocks, and over-unders I think are overrated, but they seem to be very popular just because it's more like race specificity. Because even if you're a climber, you're never probably riding, or even a time trialist, you're never really riding just like at this fixed 1 power. So like even if you're just doing a time trial up a climb, the fastest way to ride up most climbs is not to ride at your 100% critical power the whole way. It'll be to go like quite a bit above on the steep sections where you get a better return on speed for investment, and then on the flatter sections just focusing on aero and putting out a bit less power, and then the same in a flat time trial as well. And then of course in a race you're going to be following surges and attacks. So I think because of that, people like to do over-unders more than they would in running for like event specificity, although from my understanding of the physiology, it probably doesn't really make a difference that much, but a lot of people enjoy that more as well. So
just related to where you're saying not many teams are using like lactate guided testing or training. How, I guess in your experience of moving from cycling to including running, how beneficial is it having a power output for an interval where that's a really direct measure of your internal work being done, versus like in running you maybe have heart rate, and that's got its benefits and drawbacks, but you don't have that direct measure in running? And do you think that's maybe why lactate guided sessions are a bit more common in running, because it fills that gap that having a power meter can give in cycling?
Yeah, that's a really excellent point, Owen, because basically the power meters are so accurate now, and like lactate, as I'm sure you know, that it's actually got a much bigger margin for error than your power meter. And also, like, say your LT2 might be at 2.4 millimoles one day, it might be, I don't know how much could maximum, it could vary within one individual, but maybe it could be 4.1 the another day or something. And so if you're just looking at lactate, you might be thinking, oh, I'm training much harder today, and like you're not really, you're running at the same pace, it's the same metabolic cost. It feels, if the RPE is the same, then that's more like what matters. And so and then also with what we're saying is like with cycling economy not varying that much either, like the power output and RPE really, I think, have to be the key metrics. And I can see with running how it's probably nice to have the lactate there as well. But like power meters in cycling really are just so useful. And I think if you can ever get to a point where you've got something like that in running, it would be very popular.
It's the holy grail, right?
Yeah, I mean, people have tried. I just don't think they work very well. They're reverse engineered to pretty generic data. It's not calibrated to you as the individual, trying to take into account like wind resistance and how your economy changes going up a gradient. All this sort of stuff is so variable. Like just like you, Marinus, at 6'3" versus me at 5'8". If we're both running into a headwind, that's going to make quite a big difference. Also running up a hill and just, I don't think, well, we're definitely not there yet with running power. And I'm not sure if there's enough appetite for it, to be honest.
Do you think that's the problem? Just that no one really cares, no one wants it that much, or do you just think it's surely?
I think there's just not enough of a desire for it. I don't think people see the use case for it, and I think there probably is a use case if you've got it set up and well calibrated. But I think in the whole, Pace does a good job, doesn't it? Pace does do a good job. It's because, and it's assuming you're running in a controlled environment. But
yeah, can I put to you some challenges to your heart rate methods? Because I hear you talk. Sounds like you all use heart rate quite a lot in your own training, racing, and coaching. But from my own personal racing, coaching, training experience, like my heart rate at the same external, power output and RPE can be quite different day to day. And if I just like pace an interval session or a race by heart rate, I could either massively underdo it or blow up really quick. So I'm just surprised that you find it so useful. Maybe there's something in there in the difference between running and cycling, but I don't know. Do you not find it changes quite a lot with like fatigue, for example? Like if you went out and doing a threshold session and you were tired, but you were insistent on running at your LT2 heart rate or within 5 BPM of it or something, would you not end up running at 5K pace some days or just not even be able to reach it, and then other days you'd kind of be running at marathon pace if you're just coming off a deload week or something?
Shall I take this one, Owen? I'll give my thoughts first.
Yeah,
and
go for it,
I think I see heart rate as just one more tool in the toolbox. I think it's great. I think it is useful, and I think it does give you an idea of like the intensity you're working at, especially when it's calibrated against a lactate curve. But at the same time, I'm not exclusively using heart rate at the expense of pace and, most importantly, effort. And when I have conversations with athletes, I sort of lay out the hierarchy as in effort is the top. That is your underpinning anchor point for how hard should you be pushing this session. So if it feels hard, it's hard. It doesn't matter what your heart rate's doing.
Exactly.
The heart rate, I think you can then use that to give you some guardrails and put some, you want to be within a certain range rather than going, you want to hit exactly this heart rate in this sort of session. So there's probably going to be a sort of ballpark where you want to be. And if you're seeing that, if there's a mismatch between your heart rate and your RPE, I think that in itself is useful information. It probably tells you that actually if you're finding this really hard but your heart rate isn't that high, well, you're a bit fatigued, you're a bit overtrained potentially, you're not that well fueled, there's other stuff going on.
Or you're a triathlete.
Or your triathletes are just chronically overtrained, aren't they? So that's... whereas if you're fresh and tapered, your heart rate actually might be higher than normal for a given RPE or pace. But that's having that background information, that context is the key. So I think my own evolution and how I try and teach athletes about intensity control and managing where you are in that spectrum is heart rate is a great tool to initially calibrate you. But once you've done that, you can rely much more on effort. But if you just go straight in with the effort, which I have tried to do with some athletes, they can't give you a number. You say, how hard was it out of 10? And they're like, it could be a 5, could be a 7. I don't know. I don't really understand what you mean. They're not that well in tune because they haven't got a whole history of endurance training. Whereas if you start with your LT2 is 170 and your LT1 is 150 and you want to be somewhere in that range, people they learn what that should feel like. I mean, personally, in my own training, I look at the heart rate, but when I go out and do a rep, obviously heart rate's not going to be that representative in the first rep of a 6x5 minutes, for example. And I would just go off with effort. And if my heart rate wanted to stop working, I'd be pretty confident I could run at the intensity I wanted to for a given session.
Yeah.
That's my take.
I think also, I guess also going back to the power meter point, I think anyone that would want power in running, like good power in running, also understands that it's probably really, really, really difficult to do. So just hasn't tried. And I think in that, because of that, heart rate is then the next best thing to use. And yeah, I'd agree with Dan. Like there's days where when you give RPE that slightly higher rating, I think, okay, I'm not getting within 5 beats of where the lab data says my LT2 heart rate is, because that just feels too hard today. I think you do see people being quite similar in terms of the pace that they're running their sessions at. Probably suggests actually like maybe some quite good like training, load management, and like their structure. Like if you're doing the session on the same day every week with a similar amount of work the days before, you're probably in a fairly similar state. And then that also means your assessment of RPE is more accurate, because you know how you should feel on Friday when you're doing your threshold session, because you've done the same 4 days leading up to it with a similar intensity. Whereas if you're completely chopping and changing all the time, then it probably becomes a bit harder, and maybe either there's differences in pace, or you're not actually weighting your RPE enough and just going by pace.
I think that's another reason it probably works better for runners, is because you have such a more stable training load. Like, as a cyclist, you might do 3 30-hour weeks, and then you do a 10-hour week, and then you do a stage race, and like the amount of freshness versus fatigue that you have one day and 1 week to the next can be like so variable. So whereas as a runner, you have a pretty stable existence most of the time, don't you? So that's probably another reason that it works a lot better. I do use heart rate as a main prescription sometimes for like closer to LT1 riding than I set people. So I might say I get them set their Garmin up so they've just got like time, heart rate, and average heart rate, and just ride to say like a 5 or sometimes bigger, like 10 up BPM range. Say like 4 or 5 out of 10 RPE. And that's about when I'd use it. But I think for heavy domain work, I wouldn't use. Yeah, very occasionally I might say like you want to be above your LT1 heart rate as a minimum. It's just like another thing to throw in there. And for severe domain work, I definitely wouldn't use it. And I even find it's disappointing how poor it is even for like session analysis. Like sometimes you can do really hard VO2 max sessions, you're breathing really hard, you can feel in the moment it is really hard. Then you look back at your heart rate and it's not actually gotten that high compared to if you'd done a sort of mid heavy domain session. And I think that's illustrates that the relationship between heart rate and oxygen consumption is pretty good at moderate and heavy domain intensities. But as you start getting close to VO2 max, it really breaks down quite badly, doesn't it?
When I've you mentioned yourself doing some training sessions and looking at the power output, and I've definitely heard that listening to interviews with professional cyclists of I did this session before this race and this session again, and the power was better. Are they also looking at the corresponding heart rate then, or is it literally just the power that you did that session at, and you're not actually looking at that heart rate as well to measure like, okay, I did it with 20 more watts, but also the average heart rate was 5 beats higher?
Yeah, you'd only ever look at the heart rate, really moderate intensity. And like when I say, like a lot of what most cyclists doing is more like VO2 max work, I think it's probably just so much closer to max effort than what runners have to do to be conservative. So yeah, most of the time when people are saying, "Oh, I did better numbers," like I did 4 by 5 minutes at 480 and then I'm doing it 520, like that's probably 4 by 5 minutes, at least a 9 out of 10 session effort or something. Which, if you equate that to running, it's like doing, if your 1500 meter PB is 4 minutes, then you would do like 410 4 times in a session, or like not even that, like 405. But yeah, and another bit which makes me think, I'd like to bring up that I think runners are quite bad for always having short recovery between reps, and that's something that they could perhaps learn from cyclists. And I also, because I think a lot of these things we've been saying, like differences between running and cycling, it's like, well, there's a good reason there's a difference there. But I think the reason runners don't like to take longer recovery between reps is because they don't just want to stand around or be seen shuffling at 7 minutes per K, because it feels like and looks like a waste of time. Whereas like on a bike, to just cruise around at 100, 150 watts for 10, 20 minutes is really quite nice. So people are quite content to like, I do this effort up this hill, I ride that as hard as I can, or, like I said, pretty hard. And then I'll cruise down the descent, which is both practical, and then I'll go to this other climb, and then I'll do another effort up there. Or maybe even I'll just go for a ride that's got like 4 or 5 different nice climbs on, and I'll just ride hard to the top of them. And it's like, it's quite practical and like kind of nice to just ride easy between those hills. Whereas if you're going out for a run and you're like, okay, I'm going to do 4 by 5 minutes really hard around the track, and then I'm just going to like sort of walk, jog, shuffle for 20 minutes in between these efforts, people are going to be looking at me thinking like, what a weirdo, even if maybe that is the optimal way to do it. And you do see some groups do take longer recovery between their 2K reps or whatever, don't they? But it's just a lot more rare.
Yeah, I think I reckon there's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, I like short recoveries if it's more supposed to be a heavy domain threshold session, just because it forces people to not run them too hard, because they just can't. Like physically, you can't. If you only got a minute recovery between your 6-minute reps, you're probably not going to get the intensity completely wrong. Otherwise, you're not going to complete the session. But I definitely agree.
I would go about that by, in cycling at least, I would just say, well, don't do 6-minute reps, do 15, 20-minute reps.
But I think you also then get the neuromuscular load becomes quite high, and the pace that you can run at drops off quite a bit in terms of running. I think there's just different fatigue mechanisms there. And I for
sorry,
example,
I interrupted you anyway. Yeah.
No, it's all right. But then, I definitely agree though that runners don't like taking recovery in between when they actually need it. Like, for example, the classic like 5K session, 5 by K off, and people take a minute rest. Well, you're just compromising then the intensity that you can do on those K reps. If you're
people would say
a
they're time restricted, but say like a classic VO2 max session, I might give someone would be like 3 times 6 minutes or something. Even if you take like say 10 minutes instead of 2 minutes, like it's not really taking that much more time. You're taking like an extra 15 minutes, and like maybe if you're only doing a session like that, not every day, once, twice a week or something, like I think it's worth it just to take that bit longer to recover.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a tradition thing, and also, like you said, it's quite nice to go spin at 100 watts, whereas actually the probably equivalent recovery is walking in running. Most people are just too close to their LT1, even if they're just jogging quite slowly, to properly recover. Maybe not if you are like really well trained, but if you're like the average club athlete, just reactive running is going to be actually a significant percentage of their VO2 max. So then actually, can you recover? And then it's all about just I think people do like to be efficient, right? And I don't know. But I think it's also this mentality of, if I keep recovery short, I'm getting more stimulus out of the session because my heart rate's staying really high. And I don't think that's true, but I think that's the thought process people are going through. I think like one-to-one recoveries at least makes sense. If you're doing that sort of in like severe intensity domain work, and taking longer is not necessarily a bad thing.
I think there's maybe some nuance in terms of the like heart rate response you're looking for in a session. Like if you're doing like 3-minute reps at like threshold, you probably do you actually want to keep it high, just because it's going to be quite a lagging response when you then start the rep. Whereas I do agree, if you're doing, running wise 15-minute reps at like sort of more marathon intensity, there's probably no harm in actually jogging for 20 minutes between them if it's part of your long run. Like
I agree.
it's gonna, the heart rate response is gonna be fine. And as you say, with the severe intensity stuff, like do better quality reps. And when we talk about, like improving your VO2 max, it seems to be getting it above 90% or 95% of the heart rate. Like if taking an extra minute means you can achieve that better and with a better sort of mechanical stimulus as well, then that's probably worth it. But yeah, there's probably some sessions where it does make sense to have shorter recoveries just to keep the response in the right place.
I think recoveries become the most important times of short recoveries is when you're doing these. I think like these sessions where you're doing 25 400s off 30 seconds rest, and you want it to be more of a heavy domain session. Having the short rest keeps it more aerobic and keeps the heart rate high. If you're doing 5, 6, 7, plus minute reps, recovery doesn't matter. And if you're doing like severe intensity domain stuff, like recovery doesn't matter. You can take as long as you want. It's more just about what work have you done. But I think if you are doing these short reps and you're taking long recoveries, you just reduce the aerobic stimulus there. Like if you're doing 10 by 30 seconds and you're taking a minute between, your heart rate is not going to get very high. Your VO2 is never going to get that high. So it's not that much of an aerobic session. But you do 6-minute reps, well, you take 6 minutes rest. That's just, you end up being out there for a long period of time and maybe not the most efficient use of your training hours.
Yeah. There's definitely like some mechanical stress that then comes in, right? Like I know like those bigger marathon sessions at the end, I'm just like, my legs are just sort of just not feeling as good. And if it's like, okay, increase that by 10 minutes because you take a longer recovery, it's just going to make that probably worse, that mechanical stress.
Well, I think this is another one of the reasons why, you're reluctant to take the long recoveries in running is because, like, let's say even if you were a well-trained runner and you can like jog at that equivalent metabolic intensity to a cyclist doing 150 watts, then like even though the metabolic intensity is low, there's still going to be like a muscular load which is going to sort of contribute to your fatigue at the end of the day, the week, the month, in a way that would be pretty negligible with cycling. And when with running, in terms of like the muscular cost, you're dealing with a much more limited fatigue budget. You're like, do I want to use so much of that on jogging at 7 minutes a K between my recovery, my reps? Whereas in cycling, like that's just not a concern.
That's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last few weeks, is actually like the physiological benefit versus the mechanical cost of any training session you're doing. And in cycling, that doesn't, it's not a thing. The mechanical cost is so low, but it doesn't really factor into that equation. I would, is my opinion, as a runner who's done some cycling. But in running, it's, am I actually getting benefits from doing an hour easy run versus the mechanical cost going into the next training day? And that's sort of, that sort of led me on to thinking about, and I think relevant to this podcast, is cycling something that can add volume without that mechanical cost? Could you actually have higher quality easy days if you're on the bike as a runner versus you're going out for an easy run, which probably isn't giving you that much stimulus, but is going to lead to more mechanical fatigue going into your next hard session? What are your thoughts on the benefits of cycling for runners?
Yeah, so I think you'd want to, I think it could be useful, definitely. And I think some sessions that you could do on the bike as opposed to running would be like longer, very low intensity sessions. So like, say, rather than you, Dan, going out and jogging at 6 minutes per K for 4 hours, you could maybe go and ride the bike for 4 hours at, equivalent heart rate, like 100 BPM or whatever. And so you could get the same like cardiovascular stimulus without that muscle breakdown. And because, even if you did go and do that running, it's like, is it almost a negative running economy stimulus, because you're you're running at a speed that's like so different to your race pace. And then I think the other thing that could be useful for runners to do on the bike would be like severe domain work. So just some VO2 max work basically. And I think the stuff that would be quite poor cost benefit for runners to do on the bike would be like LT1 or above, like, heavy domain work. Because I think most of the benefits there are really like peripheral adaptations, which are just not useful to you as a runner if you're just using the bike for fitness. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily totally write off that option because obviously it's more time efficient. But yeah, that would be. Well, I have coached a good few runners who use the bike as cross training, and that's kind of my approach. We might do heat training, might do VO2 max training, might do long, 2, 3 out of 10 RPE rides, some recovery 1 out of 10 RPE rides. But I'd be quite sparing, or possibly do no kind of heavy domain work with them on the bike, because I just don't think that's going to be a great stimulus. However, I have spoken, to some runners, triathletes who have got injured, done a load of like sweet spot work on the bike, got back running for a few weeks, and then had their best performances. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think
but I guess that's just, they're doing, basically you can just do way more aerobic load, and even that heavy and middle domain, heavy, whatever you call it, heavy domain intensity work, you can still, if you're doing it on the bike, you can still do way more than you could do running. And I think there is some VO2 max stimulus, central stimulus to that heavy domain work that you don't get from low intensity. Like, for example, if either of you just started jogging for a month, you didn't do any LT2 heavy domain work, I think your VO2 max would go down. But if you train as you normally do, which is mostly heavy domain, I know mostly easy with some heavy domain, your VO2 max stays where it is, which indicates to me that there is at least some maintenance or some VO2 max effect from heavy domain work, because you are close enough to it. It's like with hypertrophy work, if you're doing, like really low reps, but low weight, but you're doing enough reps, you can kind of eventually get some stimulus anyway, even though more optimal might be to go at least, sets at 8 to 12 or something.
Yeah. One of the questions I have there is, runners typically, or maybe it's just me, but I think it's runners and typically are just so peripherally limited that they can't get much of a VO2 response from cycling, because running is so whole body. So you're using your much more muscle mass versus cycling, which is quite local. So that means that you're less limited by the periphery and more by the cardiovascular system. Whereas when you chuck a runner on a bike, they just haven't got enough strength to put out a power output, which is really going to drive the VO2 up.
Yes.
And in terms of, you can see this, like typically runners will jump on a bike and they'll report, I just can't get my heart rate up on my bike. And I'm the same. If I go and do the highest I've ever seen my heart rate on a bike, even when I've done like VO2 max tests and ramp tests, is 170, which is where my LT2 is. I can get probably like into the mid to high 180s running if I'm doing a VO2 max test. So am I going to get that cardiovascular, those central adaptations from doing the bike work? And it might not be important for a real stimulus, but I don't know.
I think a few solutions there is, one of them, if you just start riding a bike regularly, you start riding even, just 5 hours a week at an easy pace, like your rate of improvement in those peripheral adaptations is going to come quite quickly. So, but before too long, that heart rate that you can access on the bike is going to come up just by regularly riding a bike. Just like when you started running, you get better at running quite quickly. And another way around that is if you want to sort of isolate the cardiovascular system more with the VO2 max work, is just to ride at an artificially high cadence. So just go like 20 RPM higher than you would do your best power output. And then you think even though the power you're putting into the pedals might be going down, the actual total metabolic power can be slightly higher, because that your internal power is increased, because just the energy to turn your legs around in a circle is increasing, and also your cycling efficiency will tend to go down. There's more like bobbing around the saddle and stuff. I guess it is effectively becoming more of a whole body movement. And then if any of the listeners listen to empirical cycling and listen to Coley's rationale about the sort of more venous return because of the high frequency of contractions, and you get a better VO2 max stimulus like that because there's more preload to the heart, then I'm not convinced about that argument either way, but I definitely think the high cadence is worth it for VO2 max, in that for a few reasons. It allows you to spend more time closer to VO2 max, either over the course of a session or a block of sessions, because you're limiting the peripheral fatigue. And then, you can just kind of get the same like O2 consumption for a lower peripheral cost. So it's even more worth doing for runners who don't care how much power they can actually put out. They just want the fitness gains.
Yeah, I have to spin at such a high cadence at any power output anyway, Marinus, just to put out anything. I'm so weak.
You'd be at 200 RPM for them, would you done?
Oh yeah. If I'm doing intervals, I'm 200 RPM.
Well, that's when I've seen a video of Kipchoge on Instagram Reels just spinning on a bike. He's going some crazy cadence. It looks like his legs are
well, it's funny, isn't it? Because the
wheel or something.
The research that's looked at at cadence and efficiency, people tend to be most efficient at 60 RPM, but people don't actually ride at 60 RPM because the muscle fiber recruitment is so much higher. So you have to access those fast twitch fibers. And then you also get this, like you were saying there with the venous return, if you've got this lower cadence, that really, there's so much muscle activation and contraction, but it inhibits the venous return and the blood flow back to the heart. And so you're actually getting penalized from a cardiovascular standpoint. It's just less easy to perfuse those muscles that are working because they're contracting and squashing the arteries and capillaries that are supplying those muscle fibers. So that's why there seems to be this sweet spot, doesn't there, between super high cadence and actually having less muscle fibers recruited per each pedal stroke, and a low cadence where you're more efficient, but then you have to recruit more fibers.
Yeah, and that optimal cadence is going to change depending on what intensity you're riding at and where you are in a ride. Like, for whatever reason, natural cadence tends to decrease as like a ride goes on and you fatigue, and then it's going to be different if you're in aero position or out the saddle. And it's lots to it.
I think we're a bit conscious of time here, but I know this is going to open up a can of worms. But one thing I'd like to cover before we stop recording is, what are your thoughts on nutrition? Because I think this is something that cyclists have really dialed in. I think carb intake on the bike is where this whole high carb revolution has started, and now is coming into that running space. And runners are now taking on 120 plus grams an hour. Not everybody, but some people, and seem to having some positive effects there. And there's some literature to suggest that is beneficial, although there was a paper that came out recently that says, maybe this has got ahead of where the science is actually at. But anyway, what are your thoughts around using nutrition to help performance in cycling, and maybe through the ends of what could runners learn from cyclists?
Yes, I think the most important, so with all my clients, I help them at least some amount with the nutrition. If they're coming to me and they're really ambitious and they want to leave no stone unturned to maximize the performance, then I'll give a lot of guidance. But if they're sort of an amateur training like 8-10 hours a week and they've got a family and kids and they don't want to worry too much about it, then I'll still try to get across a minimum that sort of most important principle is just to fuel for the work required. And by that I mean is, so rather than, if you got your your hard sessions Tuesday, Friday, then you want to be eating your most carbs on Monday and Thursday. Or at least that's when you want to be most focused on getting in enough carbs. So you do your recovery ride on Monday, Thursday morning, and then those few hours after that is your window when your muscles are most receptive to take up the carbohydrate you've ingested and store it as muscle glycogen. And then maybe you finish your long ride, your long run, whatever it is on Sunday, and the next day is a rest day. Okay, your energy expenditure for that day is really high, but what have you got on the next day? You've got a rest day. So you hear a lot of people do this backwards. They think, I burn loads of calories today. I burn lots of carbs. I need to eat lots of carbs today. When actually, you want to be forward thinking as well. Especially for something like you were saying about how big your heavy domain sessions can be on the bike, for example, or if you've got a double day of VO2 max, or some hard session, which is the amount of work you're going to be doing is going to be really limited by muscle glycogen you have going into it. Then you want to give yourself the best chance to do as much high quality work there as possible. Whereas if the next day is just a long, easy ride, then if anything, the stimulus is going to be higher if you go into it a bit glycogen depleted. I don't think it's worth that much higher that it's worth deliberately restricting carbohydrate, like deliberately, but it would only be you have a bit less carbohydrate as a consequence of being in energy balance or whatever energy balance you want to be in across the week to make it fit so that you can be glycogen loaded for those hard sessions, but then, in energy balance across the week. So for example, that might mean if you're looking at each day in isolation and what is your energy intake versus expenditure, you might be in 1,000-1,500 calories surplus on your recovery days if those recovery days precede an intense session. But then you might be in a 1,500 calorie deficit on your long easy session going into the rest day, but across the week you're in energy balance, for example. Or same principle would apply if you're trying to slightly gain or slightly lose weight, but you'd always have this framework of fuel for the work required, not just thinking about the session you've done, but what's the next session.
Yeah, I think that's definitely people fall into that trap of, okay, so it's an intensity day today, so I'm going to have probably more carbs for breakfast. And
it can't make any difference but give you more GI issues on the session.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, but it's probably more important what you've eaten in the 24 hours beforehand, just like you would carb load before a marathon. And I would definitely encourage something that I've changed in my training is, well, if someone's got a marathon specific session on the Sunday, let's go through at least a mini carb load on the Saturday to make sure that you're in the best position to execute that session. And hopefully that it takes a little bit less out of you as well. But more importantly, you can just maintain the quality of the work you're going to be doing.
Yeah. I know it's pretty I can't, because when I first started, I thought, shall I have sort of my nutrition advice as a separate service? But then I just thought I can't do that, because to me, I see it as so integrated into the processes. Like, how could you have someone planning the nutrition that isn't planning the training, or vice versa? Because it's so like tightly linked.
I think in cycling as well, it becomes just so much more important just because of the sheer amount of energy that you're expending as well. Like, I think runners to a certain extent can get away with it a little bit more, especially if actually there's plenty of people who are running very well and they're only doing 6-7 hours a week of training. That's a completely different fuel requirement to doing 25 to 30 hours of cycling. And even I think it does become important running. Certainly as you get into like 10 hours and above and you got intensity in there, by really paying attention to it. But it's certainly one of those where the more training you do, the more important the nutrition becomes.
Yeah, because it becomes less and less intuitive how much you need to eat. So like I said, back to the sort of clients I work with, if I've got someone who rides 10 hours a week because they haven't got more time to do so, with them they very often can do a reasonable job by just use this fuel for the work required principle, and then they don't have to track everything they eat, they don't have to weigh all their food and stuff. But if you're wanting to ride in the world tour, and some weeks will be 30 plus hours and some weeks are 10 hours, if you keep on eating the same amount in that 10-hour week, you're going to gain a lot of weight. And if you don't you keep eating the same amount that 30-hour week, you're going to lose weight so quickly that you can't maintain the training. And, we'll start with new clients and you give them more volume and they're just like, I can't take it. And then you check in with them, have you increased your energy intake? And they're like, no. I was like, well, no surprise, you were really tired today because you're like a 4,000 calorie deficit from yesterday. Like, I'm not saying with every rider, I'm like, you must track every calorie, but with cycling, the thing is, if you don't at least get some calibration of it, the magnitudes you can be out are just so enormous that you can really do a lot of damage. So it's at least just getting some calibration there, and if you can be more or less precise with it depending on what results you're getting from the process you've got.
Definitely. I think I could talk for another hour, Marinus, but we've got to head off for another podcast recording, which we're already late
Excellent.
for. But maybe we have to line up a round 2.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So thanks so much for your time. Some really interesting insights, and I'm sure the listeners have enjoyed the chat.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Dan 9. Catch you later.